Welcome to History Twists. Today, we will begin with some real history, things that really happened that you may find very hard to believe. But before we get started in that, we must understand two factors that have played a significant role in the USA. Everyone is somewhat familiar with racism, and it is usually thought of as impacting African Americans, which it does. But it's also important to include Asians, Jews, and Native Americans. People with disabilities, or varying exceptionalities, as I prefer to say, also suffer from prejudicial treatment.
The worst aspect of this discrimination and prejudice was the so-called eugenics movement. The eugenics movement was a social and scientific campaign that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, aiming to improve the genetic quality of human populations by, quote, encouraging the reproduction of people with ostensibly desirable traits, what was called positive eugenics, and discouraging or preventing entirely reproduction among those with traits deemed undesirable, so-called negative eugenics. In practice, this movement was often grounded in racist, ableist, and classist assumptions, targeting communities of color, immigrants, disabled people, those living in poverty, basically anyone who was not a white Protestant and rich.
So, yes, and you bring up an interesting point. Those living in poverty too, just because they didn't have money. It sounds like Ayn Rand, doesn't it?
Indeed.
You know, euthanizing has been with us for a very long time. Some of the most highly regarded philosophers, such as Plato, Aristotle, and Plutarch, just to name a few, advocated for what they called exposure of infants born with any kind of defect. What did that mean? It meant not feeding or caring for the infant. And sometimes taking the quote unquote defective infant to a pit outside of town where the townspeople could stone it to death. Sweet, really nice stuff. Disgusting. So we also know that infants born with an exceptionality, as I said, they were placed in the pit too and stoned by townspeople. And the term eugenics was coined by Sir Francis Galton in 1883 and drew on the misapplication of evolutionary theories such as Charles Darwin's and the misapplication of genetic science.
As a person with cerebral palsy, these ideas terrify me, ladies and gentlemen. These eugenic ideas gained traction in Europe and North America, influencing policies on marriage, immigration, and later on healthcare. Some countries, including the United States, I'm sorry to say, enforced forced sterilizations and other types of discriminatory legislation. Eugenic principles became widespread in academia and political policy circles. Many respected scientists, politicians, and even philanthropists supported research on selective breeding, believing it could eliminate defects and social ills. Fairs and exhibitions promoted eugenics to the public, and so-called fitter family contests encouraged participants to prove their superior lineage. Numerous U.S. states and Canadian provinces enacted laws permitting the forced sterilization of individuals considered feeble minded, mentally ill, or otherwise unfit. The Supreme Court, in its infamous Buck versus Bell decision in 1927, upheld Virginia's compulsory sterilization law in an 8-1 decision, with Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes infamously writing, "Three generations of imbeciles are enough." This case validated forced sterilization policies. He compared it to vaccination, leading to tens of thousands of sterilizations across the country.
Although some eugenicists framed their ideas as race neutral, enforcement disproportionately targeted Black Americans, immigrants, mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe, and indigenous communities. I guess it wasn't enough that we brought diseases to what is now the United States, like smallpox, which killed off 95% of their population. But now we're going to euthanize some of them. Really good stuff. Dude, it just amazes me, Dr. Deneen, that this could happen. And it amazes me how effectively it's been covered up these days.
It certainly has. There is even a dystopian novel called Master Class, written by a friend of mine named Christina Dalchier, who talks about how these policies, under very benign names with the right sort of incentives, could be adopted even in our own time.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Disability status was often conflated with ideas of criminality, poverty, or moral degeneracy, justifying the isolation or institutionalization of disabled individuals in extensive state facilities. I mean, these were big places, as we say, extensive. And it was like a warehouse. You were put there, kept isolated. So, guess what? It is a proven fact. It's an issue. If you want people to act a certain way, put them with other people that act that same way. So, if you have somebody who is already struggling with an exceptionality, and you have them isolated just with others who have exceptionalities, some of whom have more severe forms and who act out in unfortunate and inappropriate ways, they're going to learn those tactics and they're going to do the same thing. So what you're doing is perpetuating that sort of thing. It's really backwards. It's really backwards. The Immigration Act of 1924 was influenced by eugenic theories, setting quotas that favored Northern and Western Europeans while severely limiting immigrants from other regions. Many policymakers believed that restricting entry for certain ethnic groups would protect the U.S. gene pool from, quote, deterioration. After World War II, the horrors of Nazi Germany, whose leaders cited American eugenic policies as an inspiration to kill millions of Jews. Oh, okay. That this led to widespread condemnation of eugenic theories. Didn't stop it now. Didn't stop it. Though its popularity waned, yeah, did wane some, elements of eugenic thinking continued to influence certain medical and social policies. for example, forced sterilizations in prisons and among vulnerable populations well, well into the latter half of the 20th century. We know, and Dr. Deneen has relayed to me some instances where he knows people were sterilized so they couldn't reproduce.
Yes, a very dear friend of mine, I won't give her name, was sterilized against her will as late as the early 1970s.
I mean, I know people are not going to believe what we're saying, but I beg you, if you don't believe, then check it out. There it is documented, as horrible as it is. And if it sounds like Nazi Germany transplanted to the United States, think again, because some of the horrors of Nazi Germany were not transplanted to the United States. The United States transplanted those ideas to them. Think about it.
It's all too real, my friends. The worst part is eugenics provided a veneer of scientific legitimacy for racial hierarchies, entrenching racist and ableist biases in all aspects of society. And it hasn't entirely gone away. Modern ethical debates around reproductive technologies, genetic testing, disability rights still wrestle with the shadow of eugenics, underscoring the importance of informed consent, social justice, and bodily autonomy. Disability rights advocates, civil rights groups, and survivors of forced sterilization programs have fought for recognition, reparations, and greater public awareness of eugenics' harmful impact. In sum, eugenics in the United States was more than a crackpot academic theory. It significantly shaped policy, law, and public opinion in ways that continue to echo today. Understanding its history and what people might do to escape it is crucial to recognizing and challenging the legacies of ableism and racism in modern society.
You know, one of the things that is most significant about this, and this is scientifically proven data here, just because someone has some form of exceptionality. For example, let's say somebody's on the quote unquote spectrum. All right. We focus on the limitations and we ignore the value, the positive aspects. And there are positive aspects. And I don't care what kind of exceptionality it is, they're there. In the people with autism, you know, they bring with them a kind of ability to focus on things in ways that others do not. They have a lot of other assets. And the same goes true. You name any exceptionality that there is. And, well, for example, Dr. Deneen, he's in a wheelchair. What asset did he bring and how did that help for him? Well, I can tell you because I know him personally. Uh, and just let me say this, Dr. Deneen, and you're not going to want me to, but I'm going to anyhow. You know, Dr. Deneen has an encyclopedic knowledge of history. He knows, and I sometimes sort of enjoy doing this to him, bringing up something from some miscellaneous thing from, you know, ages and ages ago, and he can sit there and tell me all about it. I can't do that. I can't do that. And so, was it caused by the CP that put him in a wheelchair? No. But the other aspects of being in the wheelchair and the CP and some fortunate circumstances in his life such as people that supported him and not staying in special ed, allowed him to focus on what he loved and what he wanted to do. And I say that's an asset. I say we should use that. We should do that with all these people. Anyhow, getting back on track with our with our podcast here, and forgive me for interjecting all that, Dr. Dean.
Very touched. Thank you.
Let's reimagine the scenario here. Disabled and Black citizens establish Alaska as an independent nation in the 1920s, capitalizing on its resource wealth and shaping their future. Now, in today's episode, we delve into another real, although very little known, something that, truly, I imagine most of you don't know. Proposal from the 1920s, which was sending Black Americans and disabled Americans to live in Alaska. Only in this alternate timeline that we're imagining, they don't just relocate. They claim Alaska as an independent nation, harnessing its vast oil and mineral reserves to become a major player on the world stage. Join us as we explore how this fledgling country might have formed and thrived against all odds. In our timeline, the proposal never took off. But suppose it did. This was a proposal that was actually made in the United States Senate. Yeah. Suppose these communities not only moved north, but also declared Alaska an independent nation, as I've said, one founded on principles of racial and disability justice. How would the United States have reacted? How might global diplomacy have changed? In this alternate reality, we'll see how something intended as an oppressive measure might become an unforeseen triumph for those who faced marginalization. So let's imagine the year is 1924. Segregation is entrenched. The eugenics movement is disturbingly popular. And the Great Migration has led to tensions in northern cities. A group of influential lawmakers, hoping to rid themselves of what they considered social problems, yeah, pushes a bill through Congress offering incentives and eventually exerting pressure on Black Americans and disabled Americans to relocate to Alaska. Still, remember at this time it was a U.S. territory, not a state, but a territory. We're looking at a hidden aspect of American history, the position of people with varying exceptionalities in the early part of the 20th century. The inaccurate and dangerous eugenics movement was in full sway. Yeah, it's happening. The most critical dogma of this ideology was the terrible idea that human beings with differences had to be controlled in institutions or eliminated, or at the very least, not allowed to propagate their kind. A half century before the modern movement for inclusion, you'll see our podcast on Andrew Kramer, Christine McConnell, to learn more about recent efforts for inclusion. A group with exceptionalities formed the Handicapped Citizens League to advocate for justice. When their efforts failed, some government leaders, along with other marginalized groups, sought a radical solution. the establishment of a separate disability and African American homeland in Alaska. This really almost happened. A presidential candidate, William McAdoo, secured the backing of three very prominent leaders: Handicapped Citizens League President Shirley Mound, African American separatist leader Marcus Garvey, and the head of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and Senator Theodore Bilbo, a well known advocate of racial separation.
This almost sounds like another podcast we did in Things You Don't Know called Deals with the Devil. These three totally different individuals from varying backgrounds and parts of the political spectrum embraced this idea. Garvey proved particularly effective in promoting the plan as an alternative to the descendants of enslaved people undergoing the worst of the Jim Crow era who couldn't migrate back to Africa. In a talk in West Virginia, he set out a vision, which he said, for those that are unable to cross the ocean, we should provide a haven, a foundation of our own on which we shall stand tall as men and women demanding our portion as a free people. Conversely, those opposed to inclusion would also support this plan, as the idea of moving African Americans and persons with exceptionality from the mainstream of society would appeal, a real life example of everyone being all free to live in their own separate sections. This separation and segregation would accomplish the task of relieving what racists thought of as typical people from the burden, and you could hear the sarcasm in my voice, I hope, of having to deal with people they considered different or, God forbid, less than.
The exceptionality community could find very few opportunities within the United States. Fear, contemptuous pity, subsistence charity, which is what they most often received and still somewhat receive today. People think that, people with any kind of exceptionality get thousands of dollars of help. Not true. At any rate, these things which they received, as I said, were no substitutes for dignity, education, and employment. The booming industries of the 1920s, except for two very prominent exceptions, Ford Motor Company and Republic Steel, seemed to shut their doors to anyone requiring any kind of accommodations. State-run sheltered workshops, originally designed to determine what a person was best suited for, had become dumping grounds for those society could not find a spot for. Some other solution would have to be found, but what? It is this riddle that Secretary McAdoo tried to solve. He was a railroad executive. He was double-minded on civil rights. He persuaded President Wilson to appoint African American representatives to the Committee on Public Information and fighting for equal pay for railroad workers, while at the same time supporting segregation in the Treasury Department and declaring, quote, colored people will probably do better in their own society.
In this alternate scenario, just like the so-called homeland movement in apartheid South Africa, relocation was promoted under the guise of offering freedom and self-determination. The government framed it as an opportunity to create a society almost ex nihilo, claim homesteads, build new communities, and escape the hostility of the Jim Crow South. In truth, the proposal grew from racist and ableist motives, as we've said, removing undesirables from mainstream society. But after a critical mass of Black and disabled people arrived in Alaska, their leaders realized they held a strategic advantage. Alaska's vast, untapped resources. These other settlers, facing very harsh conditions, quickly recognized two key facts. They were very far from Washington's watchful eye, and Alaska's resource wealth, oil, aluminum, gold, huge areas for fishing, and eventually timber, could fund a fully sovereign state if they acted immediately and decisively. As more Black Americans and disabled people settled in this Alaska in the late 1920s, they formed a self-governing council similar to Swiss cantons. This body, composed of community elders from all communities, activists, religious leaders, and even a few sympathetic allies, both in Washington and Canada, boldly declared Alaska an independent republic in 1929. International recognition was not immediate. The U.S. federal government was furious. Alaska was still a territory after. However, the new Republic of Alaska capitalized on America's internal struggles, the approaching Great Depression and growing isolation of settlements over the rise of fascism in Europe were keeping the United States focused on other things. With Washington distracted, the Alaskan Council was able to consolidate power, strike informal deals with foreign investors, and begin building infrastructure that would eventually pay off in the decades to come. This was an extraordinary act of defiance for Black Americans whose rights were trampled daily across the continental United States, and for disabled Americans who faced institutionalization, marginalization, and even euthanasia. This new nation was a chance to build an inclusive society from the ground up. Central to their vision was a constitution emphasizing equal citizenship, broad civil liberties, fully accessible public spaces, and both the right and obligation for everyone to contribute.
Civil war would be avoided because so many were pleased by the reduction of Black and disabled persons in their society, you know. It became quote unquote cleaner, nicer. Yeah. Negotiations were engaged in, and a treaty whereby the new republic promised to remain an American ally. Of course, building a new country in subarctic conditions was no easy feat. In the early years, they faced some real problems. Housing was an issue. Most settlers lived in provisional structures or repurposed military barracks. The infrastructure was lacking. Roads were nearly impassable in winter, especially for people with mobility issues. Riding in a wheelchair through the snow and ice was almost impossible. Plumbing and electricity were rudimentary at best. And for the disabled citizens, the unforgiving climate posed real, almost daunting physical challenges. Yet, necessity often breeds innovation. The Republic of Alaska's early architects understood the need for inclusive design and for forging alliances with indigenous Alaskans whose knowledge of the environment was absolutely invaluable. Collaboration with Alaska Native populations was crucial. They helped the new settlers understand how to dress, hunt, and fish in the Arctic environment. In exchange, the Republic's leaders promised a respectful partnership, quite different from the U.S. federal government's track record with indigenous communities. One of the most remarkable aspects of this alternate history is the rise of dynamic leaders from both the Black and disabled communities. They formed a coalition government that prioritized civil rights, equal opportunity, and a commitment to accessibility. The Republic's Constitution mandated representative seats for disabled citizens, natives, and Blacks, ensuring their voices shaped national policy. Jazz clubs cropped up in Alaskan townships, blending with local traditions. Educational opportunities expanded for people who really had subpar or none in the United States. The reason that jazz clubs and all of that is important is because when you can export pieces of your culture, not by intent, but because people want to hear it, it brings people closer together. A great example in the present timeline was the spread of pop music in the Ukraine, which was an underground thing. It wasn't allowed. It was strictly verboten when they were under Russian control. Couldn't have it. So the Ukrainians would trade records and recordings amongst themselves because they liked it. It was fun. And it also brought ideas to them that hadn't been freely communicated before. That undoubtedly played a big role in Ukraine separating from Russia, Soviet Russia, and now fighting to maintain that independence today. So, yes, exporting certain aspects of your culture to other places is really important. Engineers and architects in this new Alaska experimented with universal design decades before it became mainstream elsewhere. They crafted ramps, wider doorways, and specialized transportation solutions so that the harsh winters would not isolate disabled Alaskans. A massive underground housing and transportation systems was one of the most significant building advancements. It's so much nicer to be able to ride in a fully accessible kind of subway underground where there is no snow. Yeah. So, and this led to a number of other advancements too. This alternate society became a laboratory for inclusive governance. What started as a forced relocation transformed into a progressive experiment in democratic representation and accessible infrastructure. By the 1930s, they'd achieved revolutionary feats, even by modern standards. Prominent and African American leader Marie Gordon, president of the Ethiopian peace movement, sought a new life in Alaska. Professor Gordon had befriended prominent rehab expert Helena Mahoney, who spent 6 months a year in Roosevelt's Warm Springs Clinic and the other 6 months in the Republic of Alaska. When World War II broke out, The head of this new Alaskan Defense Force, General Benjamin Davis, smuggled rations and guns across the Bering Strait to Russian troops under siege in Siberia.
The real game changer arrived in the mid 20th century with the discovery of massive oil reserves on the northern slope of Alaska. In our timeline, oil was found in Alaska in the late 1960s, leading to the building of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in the 70s. In this alternate scenario, the Republic of Alaska was positioned to capitalize on these discoveries as a sovereign nation. As the Republic developed, new leaders such as athlete turned stateswoman Joe Kendicott, author of the wonderful disability inclusion book, The Other Side of the Mountain, and former bank president Arthur Gaston, a civil rights leader in our own time, come to power in a new nation. These leaders sought to engage with the larger world outside of North America. This was the moment the world took notice. The Republic negotiated deals with major Asian and European companies, often on more favorable terms than those available in the continental United States. The revenue influx enabled Alaska to build a robust welfare system, invest in technology for fully accessible infrastructure, and fund top-tier universities that attracted global talent. As the Cold War escalated, the United States and Soviet Union vied for influence over the strategically located Republic of Alaska. Alaska had agreed to remain an ally of the USA, but it maintained its autonomy and in some instances remained neutral. Separated from Russia by just the Bering Strait, Alaska's position made it a hotbed of intrigue and a place similar to Switzerland in our time for negotiations. Beginning in the mid-1960s, Alaska joined forces with other newly independent nations in Asia and Africa, advocating for minority rights and decolonization. I think Alaska played the role for the exceptionality community that Israel played for the worldwide Jewish community, serving as both a refuge in time of need and an example.
The Republic hosted peace conferences, leveraging its unique moral authority. A nation of historically oppressed peoples who had built a thriving democracy in the far north. Initially quite hostile, the U.S. slowly recognized Alaska's sovereignty and accepted it, and thought that it could help to stabilize the region and secure some strategic alliances. Over time, the economic ties advanced and warmed. Cross-border trade and joint environmental protections were established.
Also, Alaskan jazz musicians and folk storytellers became ambassadors, touring the globe to showcase the country's multicultural heritage. Disability advocates from Alaska led international efforts, influencing early global discussions on human rights and accessibility standards. When Judy Heumann, Aaron Kloop, and many of the other scholars of the inclusion movement were beginning their work, see my Panther Bircher podcast and Things You Don't Know to see an alliance that created early forms of accessibility. They came to Alaska to learn from the founders. It is truly fascinating to imagine a world in which a nation founded, as Dr. Weaver said, by people marginalized in the United States gains international prestige. Their moral credibility, coupled with resource wealth, allowed them to shape global conversations about self-determination, civil rights, and disability advocacy. This wasn't just a so-called petroleum state. They were a beacon of inclusive governance.
Of course, No country is without its internal struggles. The indigenous peoples of Alaska, for example, the Inuits, had to navigate new power structures, and some felt overshadowed by the waves of settlers and rapid industrialization. Balancing economic development with environmental stewardship was an ongoing challenge, particularly given the fragile Arctic ecosystem. Political factions within this new republic and things that were debated was how to distribute oil revenues fairly. The Populist Party, led by Royal Baskerville, wanted to eliminate all income tax in favor of a value added tax on luxury goods. The Consolidation Party wanted to expand social services and stem cell research. Party leaders worry about the future of the republic as the population ages. And they're also talking and debating how to preserve cultural identities. I mean, you have some very diverse people here. You have African Americans, you have people with exceptionalities, varying exceptionalities, often called disabled, and you have indigenous communities. And there was a real effort to preserve the cultural identities for each of those groups. As I've mentioned before, how do you balance? How much influence do you allow for foreign oil corporations? And eventually, I think they determined that having foreign or oil corporations there was not the thing to do, that they could actually have their own oil corporations, which meant some delay in revenue at first, but then a revenue that was theirs to manage. Despite these tensions, the Republic's core principle, equitable representation for all, anchored its governance. This social contract ensured that even dissenting voices had a platform, preventing the kind of authoritarian rule that resource rich nations often encounter.
Well, my friends, what did we learn from imagining a Republic of Alaska founded by Black and disabled Americans in the 1920s? As we said before, the policy meant to segregate became the catalyst for a new nation championing equality. Necessity drove pioneering work in accessible architecture, universal design, and social policies decades ahead of its time. Disability advocate and Harvard graduate Brooke Ellison, a dear friend of mine that we're going to also do a podcast. And I picture her in this society as perhaps a chief judge or a prominent legal figure, once said that in order to create a society in which all are welcome, it is necessary to think in the long term. Today in this world, my friends, we think about the here and now. We don't often think of the long-term cultural, environmental, or social consequences of immediate policies. So a society like this would be thinking like a chess master, 6 or 7 steps ahead of the world. In a smaller nation, this applies to Canada in our time, with significant moral authority and wealth through resources, and punch above his weight in international diplomacy. And even an idealistic founding principle doesn't ensure utopia. Ongoing negotiation between quality of life and long-term changes between economic, environmental, and cultural concerns is both inevitable and very valuable. Someone once defined democracy as the worst form of government except for all the others. And we see that dictators gain their initial popularity by appearing to solve problems quickly, but the long-term consequences morally, socially, and environmentally are unbearable. So take a, a look at this world that very easily could have been, my friends, and think about the good aspects of it and how we can incorporate them into our own life today, both as a people and as individuals.
We hope that you've enjoyed this and that perhaps it will stimulate some thoughts that you may have about any number of different issues. And we hope that you'll come back and join us again real soon. We have some good things coming up. We would appreciate your like and your subscription, which doesn't cost you anything. And if you have comments or you have ideas that you'd like us to explore, hey, we're open. You know, give us a shout out, and we'll see what we can do. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye.
So long, friends.